Hello, and welcome back to our third and final episode of the DD Geopolitics live stream for the weekend. I am your host, Sarah, and I am joined once again by my regular Mark Sleboda after feeding his crows, our black-pilled nihilists. So, Mark, how are you today? How's your weekend going so far?
Nihilist? Never, never. Cynic? Yes. Realist? Yes. Nihilist? No, not really.
Yeah.
Sarah, thanks. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Double D Geopolitics. And wow, was that an inspirational intro? Like I had goosebumps. I had chills. I'm like all psyched now. Right. That was a great summation video clips to bring us, to the state of reality through the sea of disinformation and propaganda and neocon fantasies that we've been inundated in for the last 2+ years.
Well, today we're going to talk about, we have a few updates. We have the Crocus investigation of by Russia. We have a little bit of a front update, and then we have an article about Joe Biden that you wanted to discuss. So it's up to you where we start, but yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, okay, so let's just get the Crocus out of the way because there's not actually that much information. The Russian committee assigned to investigate it and the Russian FSB director has once again confirmed to us the Kiev regime's involvement in the terrorist attack on the Crocus City Music Hall just outside Moscow. And he tells us that their military intelligence, which means Budanov, big surprise there, right? Kirillov, I like the dark Budanov, the genocidal Bond villain, crazy man in the GUR, the military intelligence network. So they're confirming now that they are directly involved, right? Before they said they were involved. Now they're saying they're directly involved. They're not giving us any further indication, although they are specifically talking about ISIS-K's involvement as a middleman, right? As the bag man here, if you will. Which was something, I don't know if we talked about it with you, but I've talked about it enough on every other channel that ISIS-K is essentially a U.S. proxy, right? We had reports was it the Financial Times? I believe it was the Financial Times a couple of years ago that essentially the entire remnant military and security services of the forces of the U.S. proxy Afghan government just decamped to ISIS-K. They just joined up, and they admitted it outright, and they're like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that tells us. And we've also had statements from Hamid Karzai, whom you may remember was at one point the U.S. appointed proxy president for Afghanistan, but he had a falling out with them. And he is on the record as saying that he does not distinguish between ISIS-K and the United States, that the U.S. was supporting terrorists in Afghanistan. So they've essentially become kind of a proxy force for the U.S. / guns for hire. And they themselves then went and recruited a few, plausible deniability of a few Tajiks that they were able to extremize to a degree in a shorter period of time, and also convince with promises of payments and escape to carry this out. Now, the question is, what role did the Kiev regime's military intelligence? I would suggest that it's probably another middleman role, where the United States provided the proxy, and all of the the instructions, the details went through the Kiev regime's military intelligence. So we've got layers of responsibility here. The ISIS Khorasan, recruited a couple of local Tajiks, ISIS K, Kiev regime's military intelligence, the United States, right? But they're all layers of involvement. And this was just one of what was and still is intended to be many such asymmetric attacks in Russia, right? There's, I think, long been the recognition that the Kiev regime can't win this on the battlefield. So the neo-Nazi raids and missile strikes, rocket strikes in Belgorod, attacks in Crimea, these sabotage attacks within Russia, the drone strikes on oil refineries and depots. The goal, and previously we saw these ridiculous drone strikes trying to hit skyscrapers, business centers in Moscow City, the business district of Moscow. All of this is intended to, in the words of the New York Times, to bring the war home to the Russian people, because they can't win the war on the battlefield, right? This was actually, I think, to some degree, factored in the beginning, but it was believed that the economic sanctions would crush the Russian economy, and therefore the people would rise up against Putin, overthrow the government, Russian forces would have to withdraw, and then it would just be a matter of redirecting the Russian government to, essentially capture them and redirect them against China. It was expected to be this quick, complete defeat of Russia. Just absolute, just fantasy, just absurd, supremacist, exceptionalist fantasy. None of it played out that way, right? So that didn't work out that way. Now the goal is the hope that these shock attacks will increase political instability in Russia and essentially make Russia come to the negotiation table on terms more preferable to NATO and the Kiev regime than they would earlier, right? It is about raising costs for Russia, increasing political costs at home, with the hope that Russia essentially would be satisfied with less. They want Russia to not completely regime change the regime change that they installed in Kiev in 2014. That's the goal now, right? I think too many people look at this conflict, and they look at winning and losing in military conflicts as a binary option. You win, you lose. It's not that simple. It really never has been, and it's certainly not going to be in this conflict. Like, let's take, I think what happened in Syria is useful for us in a number of ways to understand how the U.S. is going to deal with the end game of this conflict, which is essentially it continues to be a frozen conflict, right? You've got Turkey and 100,000 jihadis still under arms in the, are they calling it the new Syrian army, the Syrian new army, some ridiculous name that they're calling. They've cobbled together all the jihadists under their banner in northern Syria. In eastern Syria, you've got the U.S. forces and their Kurdish proxies still camped out on Syria's oil and wheat fields, preventing any economic recovery in the country. And then, of course, you've got the majority of the population and territory of the country under the Syrian government, backed by Russia and Iran and Hezbollah. But who won that conflict? Well,
Hezbollah.
By some definitions, yeah. I mean, you could say that the regime change in Damascus was averted, right? That was the goal.
Correct. And don't you think we're still there though? Like, there's still that goal that's hanging over. So I like, we're like push a list a little bit on this. Remember the legislation that went through for Assad?
Yes.
Rashida Tlaib, I believe, was one of the co-sponsors, which is absolutely asinine while her people are being bombed. And then we have multiple strikes on Syria. And then now with in the protests, a lot of these college protests have an anti-Assad link. So I'm wondering if that's why we're not even like discussing pulling the troops from Syria anymore. And that is like, that's probably going to be another foothold. Is that what you kind of think about for Syria?
It's never going to be given up, right? Because for geopolitical reasons, right? The U.S. occupation of Syria, unless the costs are risen too high for them, is going to continue for years, decades, probably. I mean, how long were we in Afghanistan? 20 years? There's several. First of all, the U.S. can't admit that it lost in Syria. Right. It simply can't admit it to itself or to anyone else. It certainly can't admit that it lost to Russia. And it adheres to this policy of an belief that by camping out in East Syria, they are disrupting an Iranian axis of influence that runs from Iran through Syria to Hezbollah and into the Mediterranean. So they believe that by sitting camped out there, they deny Russia a victory. They deny the Syrian government in Damascus any real economic reconstruction and consolidation of the country. And they continue to geopolitically provide a foil as they see it against Iranian geopolitics as a potential threat to Israel. Right.
We're going to explore Iran a little bit more later because of the helicopter crash if we have time. But I do want to ask a little bit more about ISIS-K. It wasn't you and I that spoke about it. It was me and someone else, but they talked about ISIS-K kind of being a guns for hire or like a default kind of like, we'll just blame it on them. These guys that bombed Crocus they've admitted that they were in Idlib. They've admitted that they'd gone through Turkey. Do you really think that they're actually part of ISIS-K, or is this just sort of some like one-off, like, paid for attack? And like, is ISIS-K really this big of a threat? Because even the Iranian attacks, they were kind of attributed to ISIS-K. ISIS-K took responsibility. But I mean, we've never really heard much about ISIS-K until now.
No, and we have actually. I mean, if you read into it, maybe it hasn't.
Yes, we have. But
normal people. Okay, ISIS-K, again, if they're not a real terrorist organization by the common conception of what a terrorist organization is, right? They are the remnants of the Afghan military and security services and dissident forces against the Taliban in Afghanistan that are essentially under U.S. control because the U.S. and anyone else who wants to fund them to do something is providing, the funding for them, right? Is still providing, their paychecks, if you will. And if you take a look at who ISIS-K has conducted attacks against the United States that occupied their country supposedly for 2 decades, no. Against Israel, who is conducting a very real genocide against fellow Muslims in the Middle East? No, they're worried about the Taliban. They've done attacks against Iran. They've done attacks against China, against Chinese engineers in Pakistan, and now against Russia, right? And actually, there was in the run-up to the Crocus City, there were a few little ISIS-K related destabilization events. Now, were these 4 guys that did it, were they ISIS-K? No, they were a couple of recent local recruits who were paid to do something, right? I mean, ISIS-K exists and they were involved in this, but really they're just the low end of the, they're the literal gun for hire. They were directed then by Kiev, but up above that, of course, was the U.S. providing the framework for the whole thing.
I have another question. Why do you think that Kiev chose these kind of mercenaries or terrorists for hire instead of their usual people who are those like Russian defectors or whomever?
Yeah, because here it is less easy to it is easier to deny it was them, right? If my first thought right away was the Russian volunteer corps, right? These crazy Russian neo-Nazis with this involvement of Ilya Ponomarev, right? And this like. And because they've claimed responsibility for multiple sabotage and attacks before. But I guess it was decided that that's too obviously linked with Kiev. And they wanted the plausible deniability. Right? They didn't want to claim credit for this. They were happy to celebrate it, but they didn't want to claim credit. And remember, the intended target was not a picnic concert. The first intended concert was a shaman concert at the same venue a few weeks earlier. And shaman is really hated in Ukraine by the adherents of the Kiev regime, by the far right, because he has become this big patriotic, pop rap singer in supporting of the government and in supporting of the intervention in the Ukrainian civil conflict, the SMO. He was the intended target. But Russia increased security at that time, possibly through a tip-off from the U.S. playing some type of devil's advocate game there. But then they evidently called off the attack, and when security was lowered back down a few weeks later, they went ahead and hit the same target, just with a less, shall we say, emotive target. Right, but it was still a terror attack in Moscow. They wanted a degree of deniability. Remember how quick they were right off the bat. The United States says immediately, we know it wasn't Ukraine. Right? They were so insistent that it wasn't the Kiev regime, which was an obvious. Yeah, okay, it was them, but we're certainly not going to admit it. And they were just, a link in the chain, because the U.S. was certainly just as involved in it as they were. If not, in degree of total responsibility more so. So, that's the story there. The Russian intelligence, the government wasn't fooled for a second. I don't think it was ever believed that they were. I think, the question of who ultimately was responsible, the real battleground there is the minds of the global South, right? The minds of the rest of the world with a capital R outside the West. They didn't want them to believe that it was, Ukraine behind this. And by and large, I think Russia's quiet insistence about who was ultimately responsible and building an investigative case. And maybe they will provide some evidence, although there's always the question of, not revealing sources. But I have never had any doubt, from once the relations of the Tajik perpetrators and fleeing towards Ukraine, everything was clear at that point to me exactly what happened. And I think the majority of the people out there with two brain cells to rub together and who are informed, like, I don't know, all the audience of Double D Geopolitics are probably reached the same conclusion and weren't fooled either.
I do want to know a little bit then, what do you think? So I'm kind of shocked that this kind of result came out so fast, like this sort of investigation, and that Russia was willing to share the result or the results of their investigation. I can't help but think that they did that on purpose so they could have another not another reason, but like they're going to ratchet it up again. What effect do you think that this outcome has on the actual conflict in Ukraine? None?
No, I don't think it really has any effect, right? The desired effect on their side was to politically destabilize Russia. And that quite obviously hasn't happened. If anything, it only increased support, even in the aftermath of the presidential election rather than before it. And it certainly didn't provide any lessening of support of the Russian population for the SMO. Of course, this was not the first of such asymmetric attacks against Russia, and it won't be the last. There will be others. And as the regime faces increasing defeats and bigger areas of territory, the Donbass is fully liberated, and then perhaps cities like Zaporozhye and Kharkov and Odessa are eventually really put under threat, we'll see many, many more acts like this, right? Many more such asymmetric, attacks that are primarily at a psychological. The U.S. military manuals, they call them unconventional warfare.
Yep. Can you give us an update or maybe your opinion on how the Kharkiv offensive is going, how the front is going, and then we'll move on from the actual theater of war?
Yeah. Okay. So there's no question at this point that Russia has not only a decisive fires advantage, air superiority, military industrial superiority. Now they have a very real manpower advantage, right? For the first time in this conflict. I mean, you can say it started about back in September or October, but it's really starting to have a show now. And it's not only in total, combat ready manpower, but it's in the quality of that manpower, because the Kiev regime has lost so many of its officers and NCOs at this time, and you can't just replace those with some guy who was abducted off of a bus in some village in Transcarpathia 4 days ago, right? The videos that we see of the press gangs, their increasing brutality and methodology, and the tactics that people are resorting to try to escape the prison for the Ukrainian people that Ukraine under the Kiev regime has come, with people drowning themselves trying to cross the rivers into Romania, or elsewhere in the mountains. Or I saw one horrific video of a guy who was being press ganged. I don't know where he got it from, but he blew up a grenade, killing himself and blowing off the legs of the press gang officer, who was then squealing like a stuck pig. But that was all caught on video. It's pretty horrific, and it shows how desperate the Ukrainian people are to avoid this now. And you hear this all the time from particularly the far right commanders. They're very, very angry that everyone is doing everything they can to avoid being conscripted and escape the country or hide or whatever else they can do now. And all the reports on the ground from Ukrainian social media, again, is about how all the big cities, I don't know about Kiev, but certainly Zaporozhye, Odessa, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, they've all become ghost towns because the men just don't go out anymore, because with the new legal and enforcement powers of the press gangs, of the conscription officers, everyone is terrified. And so that's the desperation they're at. So because of these shortages of everything, Russia decided to open a new front in Kharkov, right? This is a relatively small force there. It's somewhere estimated between 50 and 55,000. It was obviously never intended to take Kharkov, right? To take Kharkov, you need probably upwards of 300,000, right? For a city of 1.3 million people, 2 million before the war. The largest real urban center that Russia has taken so far has been Mariupol, which was a pre-war population of 200,000. You see the scale of the difference there. And I think that at this phase of the special military operation, Russia is not ready to attack any big urban center outside of the Donbass, right? Yes, they'll lay siege to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk yet, right? Pokrovsk, that's as big as they're going to get. They still hope not to have to destroy those cities. And of course, that would entail more civilian losses, right? Not everyone would leave. So they're hoping to avoid that. Whether that will be possible or not, depends on what Russia decides their end game is, and they probably haven't even fully decided yet themselves, and how far the West is going to go, and which, not if, but when and how NATO member states like France and the US and the UK and Poland put troops on the ground in Ukraine, right? Because I don't believe it's a question of if. I think it's a certainty. I think it was a certainty back in 2022, but that as the desperation increases, as the panic increases, the pressure towards that will get more and more and more. And remember, we're still largely fighting a few kilometers outside of Donetsk City, right? That's where the majority of the real fighting is going. So the reason for the Kharkov offensive was, one, yes, to create a cordon sanitaire to push the Kiev regime's forces that were conducting neo-Nazi raids and the shelling of Belgorod back out of artillery range and rocket system range of Belgorod, which is Lipsy, Volchansk in the east, Lipsy in the center, and then there's two more, Kazakh Lagery and another one further to a little bit closer towards the Sumy region. That front hasn't yet been opened, but almost certainly will in Sumy as well. The other reason is to stretch the Kiev regime's dwindling manpower even thinner, and that's actually where we've seen the most success of the Kharkov offensive, because they openly admitted, Krylu, I like the dark, Budanov admitted to The Economist that they have no reserves left. None. They have no reserves. So they had to strip brigades and smaller units from everywhere along the contact line, cannibalizing their own forces to build up a strong enough force in Kharkov to stop or at least slow down the Russians. And they've pretty much achieved that, right? Volchansk has now been more or less static for about 2 weeks, right? Lipsy, we hear nothing about, but there's also lots of talk about Kiev regime counterattacks now in the flanks. So they've more or less been holding. If Russia's forces are progressing, they're doing so at a grinding snail's pace now. That's the best case scenario. But the cost of doing that is now being seen everywhere else along the contact line. And a lot of these bitterly, fiercely bloody battles that have been fought for months and years, removing those forces from them along the contact line has allowed Russian forces that extra bit that they needed to push over the edge and drive what remaining forces were there out. And I'm talking about the long, bloody, bitter battle of Belogorivka, which is now firmly, this is in the last tail end of the Lugansk Republic that the Kiev regime held as a remnant of their Kharkov counteroffensive of the autumn of 2022. Finally, that was an awful, bloody, they fought hard to keep Belogorivka. We can certainly say that. Southwest of Bakhmut, Klashevka and Andreevka, the Russian Ministry of Defense has just announced in the last 48 hours, or this week, that they've taken both of them. And for those who forget, while the Kiev regime launched their southern counteroffensive, NATO proxy counteroffensive in 2023 in the summer to the south in the Zaporozhye, they also launched an equally sized attack to the east that was supposed to take Bakhmut in the north and south flanks and eventually put Bakhmut under threat. of course, that completely failed. In the north, they accomplished nothing whatsoever. In the south, they eventually managed to take two little hamlets, two little villages at tremendous cost, Klashevka and Andreevka, and that was it. They never got any further, and now they've lost those.
Let's
Right?
talk about the desperation of the Ukrainian regime since you touched on that.
Yeah.
A news just came out today. I was just sent it while we were talking. Is that they are, let me read it verbatim. In Ukraine, the general staff of the armed forces will be reduced by 60%, and the freed personnel, I'm guessing the released is what the correct translation is. Released personnel will be sent to combat units.
Sure. Yeah. They've also recently signed off on not an offer being made to prisoners, but the conscription, the forced conscription of the prison population. And recently they've also been now sending police to the front. And the threats we've heard from far right commanders is that the press gangs should be sent if they don't meet their requirement quotas for grabbing people off the streets, which gives them some extra incentive. So that's the desperation. So the other advances that we've seen are to the west of Avdiivka, just south of the Ocheretna Bloom, Krasnogorovka. We can quibble, does Russia have 80% now or 90% of the city, but it's just about finished, right? So Russia, again, very heavily fought, very bitterly, fiercely defended by the Kiev regime forces for a few months. That has now fallen in. Natailova, also Russia has pretty definitively taken that. In the Vremovsky salient, Russia has just about wrapped up Urozhaina and Staromayorsk. And we've all heard now for a couple weeks that the shelled field and basement ruins that used to be Robotyne, that the Kiev regime has finally been driven from there. And they had to give up any fantasies about doing some other Dnieper River crossing against a crinky fire bag that they were oddly obsessed with killing themselves at. That has been given up now, and those Marine battalions have been sent to Kharkov as well. So this, I believe, is a direct result of the Kharkov offensive, because they had to strip forces from all of these places that allowed Russia to, clearly break through. And keep in mind that Russia has several 100,000 contract soldiers that were signed up in the last year or so now. Remember, they are signing up 1,000 new recruits a day. And the Kiev regime just confirmed that last year they signed up, the Russian Ministry of Defense signed up in excess of 385,000, right? And they announced already a few months ago that they'd already gotten another 100,000 this year. So there's still 200, 300, possibly 400,000 Russian soldiers who volunteered for the SMO that have not been put into play yet. Right? We saw the first edition of some of those, just 50,000, into the Kharkov theater. Right? These are largely new, right? They've had a lot more training than the 3 to 4 days that the Kiev regime force, the conscripts, are getting before they're killed in the trenches. But they've been trained for months and months, a year plus, but they're not being put into the theater yet. And ultimately, I believe that's because they're waiting for NATO. They're waiting for, not NATO, but the NATO member state direct intervention. They are a reserve force. Russia has always, in this conflict, kept a certain amount of air power and missiles and so forth in reserve. And I think this is going to happen at some point, because they're not willing to lose to Russia in Ukraine. Why? Right? Because they believe, they said, we've heard it many times before. They said, U.S. global leadership is at stake in this conflict, right? We've heard that from their top officials. We've heard the rules-based order is at stake in this conflict, right? We make the rules, we give the orders, right? But Boris Johnson said it closest to home just in the last 2 weeks. Boris Johnson said U.S. hegemony is on the line. Western hegemony is on the line. That's what it's all about. They believe in this domino theory that if they lose here, that will mean that the world will stop fearing U.S. hegemony. They already have to a certain degree because they're refusing to abide by Western sanctions. But that China will then, take back Taiwan from U.S.-backed separatists there, and North Korea will invade South Korea, and cats and dogs will start living together on the streets, and so forth, right? That's they really believe all of this, and it's all tied up because ultimately what is being challenged here is their own sense of identity and their ideology, right? The supremacist, messianic idea of exceptionalism that tells them that they are morally, systemically, and societally superior to the rest of the world, and that the world would be much better off. In fact, they have not just the right, but a duty to rule the world, to make the world. They honestly believe this, right?
Mhm.
I studied in the LSE with the future blob of the U.S. and Europe, and they really honestly believe this.
Mhm.
This is what they're taught. This is what they're indoctrinated in, and they can't believe that they could lose this, right? How could they possibly lose to Nigeria with snow, right? Which is how they have referred to Russia, to a gas station jumped up as a country. This is a huge shock, not only to the hegemony they've built, but to their own messianic ideology and their sense of identity, of who they are and their place in the world. So they're not willing to give it up. And all of the Russian Russian analysts out there who say that it makes no military sense for them to send their troops directly into Ukraine, that France can muster 20,000 troops at best, and the UK has artillery pieces for one day, or artillery shells for one day of conflict. You're all right. It doesn't make any military sense, but that's not going to stop them from doing it, because when have they ever followed any rational, logical assessment or sense from the beginning of this conflict? And I think one of the ultimate tells of how they are fully encompassed by this poisonous, dangerous, messianic, supremacist ideology of exceptionalism. We heard from the International Criminal Court's prosecutor, Karim Khan, whom in an interview, surprisingly with CNN, talking about his request for ICC arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the defense minister Gallant, as well as several Hamas leaders. He was told by a Western elected a leader, he said, he didn't name him, he said, a Western elected leader told me that the International Criminal Court is not for the West. It's for the African states and for thugs like Putin, not for us. One, justice for the rest of the world, and another, justice for us, right? Or no justice for us, impunity for us, right? Why? Because we're exceptional, right? And they're thugs and Africans, right? I mean, that's the way they look at the world. They've long looked at the world that way. And it is a hubris. It is this ideology is the most dangerous ideology in the world, right? It's more dangerous than communism ever was. It's in the scope of the West, it's more dangerous than Wahhabist jihadism, and it still completely controls the Western elites. You still heard, Jesus, was it the foreign minister of Estonia this week still talking the neocon fantasy of breaking up Russia? Look, this conflict is not going to be over tomorrow, and people who think that it's, the Ukrainian military is 2 weeks away from breaking, and that it's all going to be over in a few months. No, this is going to continue for a long conflict, and more than likely, NATO member states are going to contribute forces directly at some point, and things are really going to get dicey and hairy then, with the threat of not of Russian use of tactical nuclear weapons, but of Western use of tactical nuclear weapons. But eventually, Russia will win this conflict, right? And if for no other reason than they're fighting in their own backyard, a type of conflict they've been preparing for decades, their military industrial complex is geared up to fight the war of attrition that they've been fighting. The West is not prepared for it. And they sought to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. They were quite clear about that. And in their hubris, what they have done is the Russian government, Putin, if you will, if you want to put it down to one person, has judo flipped that. And we are now looking that at the end game of this, however they try to spin it, it will be a strategic defeat for NATO and US-led Western global hegemony. And that is a world order changing event there, right? This is something that is going to change the world. There's an article in The Hill.
Yeah, we were just going to get to that. So yeah, let's explore this article that you sent me like right before the show started. I can pull it up. Hold on. Yeah. We can pull it up.
Biden is losing World War III. All right, and if you read past, all the propaganda and the rhetoric,
yeah, it's good.
Yeah, I mean, it correctly calls a lot of things. And there's this one paragraph here that starts with defending. If you want to blow that up in the middle,
there it is.
There, yeah. Defending must no longer be the watchword of the day in Biden's White House, but winning. Winning this increasingly kinetic global ideological war is our only way forward if liberal democracy is to prevail against Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping's shared vision of a so-called multipolar world, military and economically dominated by Russia and China and anchored by BRICS. There we go. It's all about stopping a multipolar world. It's all about retaining hegemony, retaining a unipolar moment. And this is just the first, maybe not even the first, but one in a series of conflicts that are going to determine the future world order, that are being fought to prevent the birth of a multipolar world, which has to be said, it's not here yet, right?
Yeah.
And if the US has their way, they're pushing the world back into a bipolar world right now by saying you're either with us or against us.
Yep.
But that's where we are. This is going to be something that you're going to tell your grandchildren about, presuming that we all have grandchildren, that the world doesn't end in a nuclear apocalypse before then, that you lived through this watershed moment where the world order was changing, underneath our very feet. And we don't economically, militarily, socially, we don't know what it looks like on the other side yet. And anyone who says they do, I think they're, either far more genius than I am, or they're doing a little bit of grift and bluster, because we don't know what this looks like. People who say, again, Russia can conventionally defeat whatever NATO forces can throw on the battlefields of Ukraine directly, right? Because the U.S. can't put all of their forces in Ukraine, right? They are responsible for imperial. I mean, for the maintenance of their hegemony, the pivot to Asia, which is supposedly more important, the defense of Israel. You know, hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops staying abroad. They can't put them all against Russia. And because they can't do that, and it would take them so long to do that, and they would lose the rest of the world in the process, they can't. But it doesn't mean that their goal here again is to raise costs for Russia, to bluff Russia to some extent, although believe they'll actually go through with it at some point, but to make Russia accept less. And Macron said it outright a couple weeks ago to the French press. He said that we must be ready to send troops in if Putin goes too far.
Yep.
What is that? What does that mean? Goes too far? I think their definition of too far is if Putin continues past Donbass.
I thought it was Odessa, but yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, Odessa's, I think, way down the end of that.
Yeah,
they're not even talking about that. I think that Kherson and Kherson City and Zaporozhye City and Kharkov are before that. And then you have Odessa. And then, of course, regime change in Kiev. Whereas, first of all, I do not believe that Russia will have truly won this conflict unless they can liberate the Russian east of Ukraine in its totality, from Odessa to Dnipropetrovsk to Kharkov. That's the minimum standard. Really, they need to regime change Kiev, right? Because the West has made it clear that as soon as this conflict ends or freezes, because it's far more likely to be a frozen conflict with no formal settlement, that they intend to pump Ukraine even more full of weapons and bring it officially, whatever has left, into NATO and the EU, and that's unacceptable. Russia cannot permit a Ukrainian rump state from becoming the West's cased gladiators, cased warriors, against Russia for decades into the future. And whereas in the beginning of this conflict, I seriously believed that an occupation of West Ukraine would be bad, that Russia should not and would not do this, because unlike East Ukraine, they do hate Russians there by and large, and it would be a guerrilla war, a forever war scenario. I've now, and I think the Russian government has come around to the same conclusion, that however bad that scenario is, it's better than West Ukraine becoming a battle platform into the future against Russia, because they are simply not going to come to any type of political settlement that would be acceptable to Russia. Why? Because their hegemony is on the line. And anyone who doubts the importance of that within their minds is fooling themselves.
Well, there's the one paragraph in the article that I really liked. You sent it to me right before the show, but I got to read a tiny little bit of it. Let me find it. It does say something about the wars, and then it actually says, oh, well, but in reality, our nation is being confronted with 3 wars: the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, and the looming war over Taiwan and the South China Sea. This is the paragraph. Actually, make that 3.5 wars if you include the war of influence we are losing in the Sahel region of Africa as U.S. abandons bases in Niger. Let's talk. I don't want to get into the nitty gritty, but we covered in depth the Russian for Ukraine front. There's 2 more, plus the one that they call a half, which I think is another one as well. Is the West losing in these theaters as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look at France and the U.S. are being kicked out of multiple countries in the Sahel, but actually he sells it too short by giving it a half a war.
Yeah.
Right? The West is losing the war of influence in the rest of the world, right? The so-called global South. every country that has not been browbeat into accepting Western sanctions against Russia, which is pretty much the whole world except the West, they've lost it. And you have actually seen articles in the last 2 years that have admitted this, that outside of the West, the propaganda bubble of the West, the English and the European dominated media spheres, where they ban RT and Sputnik and everything else, and wearing the St. George ribbon as an imprisonable offense, and so forth. Outside of that sphere, they realize, and they've written that they've lost, and they lament how popular RT Africa is in Africa, and that not just in the Sahel, but all over Africa, you've got people flying Russian flags. Not because there's any ideological Cold War remnant, or not because they want to be part of Russia or something like that. It's simple. They don't like the iron grip of the hegemon, and Russia is showing resistance, an effective resistance, and it is inspiring people and politicians and countries around the world that will have effects, ripple effects for generations into the future. The same thing, RT in South America, right? And I'll tell you, the truth of the matter is RT and other, info war outlets, if you will, do good work and they do their role. But more than anything, what reveals it is the hypocrisy of the West, right? That is the way they justify, the way they their propaganda about defending freedom and democracy in Ukraine, while at the same time supporting obvious neo-Nazis there and defending Israeli genocide of Palestinians. This hypocrisy is so apparent to the rest of the world outside of the Western dominated, English language dominated propaganda bubble, right? TV, newspapers, social media. Outside of that sphere, the rest of the world can see their hypocrisy. They don't live inundated in it, right? And again, your audience out there, the audience that I talked about there, you realize that you are the real exceptional few who can see through all of this for whatever reason that is. But you realize that you are a fringe minority, right? I'm sure you've all had arguments with friends and family and countless social media wars and the like. But there are a lot more people who realize outside of the propaganda bubble that Westerners live in, who see the reality of the world. So it's not just a war of influence in the Sahel. It's a war of influence in the rest of the world, in the global South.
Well, you said something that really got me. It grabbed me. You said the Russian is leading a resistance, and it's funny that you said that because I have a Lebanese friend that constantly says Russia is part of the axis of resistance, and generally speaking. And I'm constantly trying to say, if it weren't for Russia, like pushing back against the West, you wouldn't even have these opportunities at all.
Putin never wanted that, right? Yeah. He never wanted to be associated with that, right?
Yeah,
It's simple geopolitics and events and the US's own hubris and their, unwillingness to input any amount of realism and divide and conquer even into their foreign policy strategy anymore. They decided that they needed to take Russia and China and Iran and the rest of the world all on at the same time, and they can't make compromises with any of them, and they need to assert their hegemony everywhere. Everyone's seen Star Wars and New Hope, right? I grew up with it, right? I'm sure a lot of you out there did as well. But that classic line where Princess Leia is talking to Grand Moff Tarkin, and she says, the more you try to tighten your grip, the more star systems that will slip through your fingers. It's that simple. That's what's going on. And for those of you who doubt that, George Lucas actually has admitted that when he conceived of Star Wars, that the Empire was the United States and the rebels were the Vietnamese resistance. Yeah, he's on the record with that, which would probably be a news flash to I fund Azov drones, Mark Hamill, but that's what George Lucas has said. So yeah, that's an easy way to understand what's going on. The rest of the world has suffered too long from American hubris, from Western hubris. Not because it's not just American anymore. The Europeans are as inundated with this sense of exceptionalism as the Americans. This idea that the International Criminal Court is for Africans and thugs like Russia, but not for the likes of us. I mean, could you be any more clear about it? Right? And if you think that the Africans and the South Americans and the Southeast Asians and everyone else doesn't see here, and even the Arab elites in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Bahrain, they're all seeing the writing on the wall and how insufferable U.S. hegemony has become. And, that's why you have Saudi Arabia and Dubai, saying, you sought to dictate the global price of oil and seize another country's assets invested in the West. If you did that to Russia, you could easily do it to us, and you've set a precedent. Yeah, we don't like that. We want foreign policy options. This multipolar bit where we actually have a say rather than simply being a nominally privileged vassal is starting to sound more appealing, and that's one of the big propaganda claims that NATO, NAFO trolls and the like Russia sought to stop the expansion of NATO. And look, Finland and Sweden are now in NATO. First of all, Finland and Sweden have de facto been NATO members for a long time now in military and intelligence means. But yeah, okay. So yeah, sure, you got Finland and Sweden, but you lost the Middle East. You lost Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and the rest of the Middle East, by and large, follows along behind, and that's huge because they were, privileged vassals of the U.S. for decades, and now suddenly they're not, and I don't think that's even penetrated through their heads in Langley, in Foggy Bottom yet.
So we are out of time, but I do want to get to our super chats because they're funny and awesome. Thank you, Al and Dan, for sending us your donations and your wonderful compliments. Sarah, can you ask Mark about the recent cleanup of the Russian military or the Russian MOD? He waited until after the election, and now we're watching a very intensive cleanup of the MOD. How bad do you think it was prior to the cleanup, and what do you think about Putin running a fine-tooth comb through everything?
Yeah, it was bad enough. It wasn't Ukraine bad, but it was bad enough. I think Putin feels newly empowered with a very powerful mandate now. But he also feels confident enough to purge this from the Ministry of Defense now. He could have put it under the carpet and waited till after this conflict was over. Thinking that, it might destabilize things, it make people doubt the military, why rock the boat now? No, he's every ruble that is spent will go to the men and women in uniform, not lining anyone's pockets, right? He's cracking down real hard on this. And, it is, of course, a message not to the rest of the Ministry of Defense and the generals, but to the rest of the Russian bureaucracy as well. And Andrei Belousov, who is the new Minister of Defense, he is uniquely suited, of course, to run a very thorough audit, and which will be certainly part of his work. His other part is, of course, to ramp up the military-industrial complex even more than it already was. He was in charge of expanding, just before this, he was in charge of expanding Russia's drone production. to the 100,000 drones plus they're making a month now. So he certainly does have some experience. But also, Putin's quite clear about this, what Belousov is doing in the Ministry of Defense. I think this is what happened, that Putin realized there was corruption in the Ministry of Defense, but also that the Ministry of Defense now, with the increased share of government revenue, right, some 6.7% total of the Russian GDP now going through the Ministry of Defense, that the job was too big for any one man. And that he is very concerned that this spending that the Russian military is at now, Russia is at now in terms of military and security spending, not get too much larger, because he doesn't want to head down that path of what he says the Soviet Union did, rightly or wrongly, right? But he is very concerned with making sure that this ramp up of the Ministry of Defense also serves the civilian economy. And that's why Belousov was put in there. And you'll notice that actually part of the responsibilities of the Minister of Defense, the oversight of the military industrial, of driving the military industrial complex, was actually moved to the Security Council, nominally under the authority of Putin, but he just reassigned it to Shoigu. So Shoigu is still going to be doing the job that he was doing well at the Minister of Defense. But Belousov is making sure that, as well as putting a tight, fiscal economic control of everything, that the Ministry of Defense is also providing input into the civilian economy. Now, obviously, they're not going to be making garbage, right? Crap, right? And consumer items. But what they're doing is that these same factories are also capable of producing railroad tracks, right? And oil and gas pipelines and the like. And actually, I think that what this is showing is that, not in total, but the Russian government is moving back to an even more state-centric, state-heavy economy than they have been in recent years. They're comfortable with it. It works for Russia. Now, they're not going back to the Soviet Union, because they're still, everything, Belousov is making sure that everything is, reactive to the market. But what they actually look like they're doing is moving much closer to the Chinese model. And notice that when Putin went to Beijing, he took the entirety of the Russian government just about with him. He took every member of the economics team, from the economic development, finance ministers, to the head of the central bank, to the top CEOs of like 30 top Russian companies. I think that they are working on a much larger degree of economic integration between Russia and China than we have seen previously, right? Of a united economic Eurasia, not one country or something like that, but a more higher degree of economic trade and integration that we've seen recently. And in part of that will be the Russian economic model moving a little further away from what it became in the 90s and 2000s, closer to the way the Chinese government directs business that we see today. And who can argue that the Chinese weren't right?
Right, exactly.
It was Gorbachev and those who fucked the Russian economy, Gaidar and the like, and they're making corrections. And of course, part of the course correction is that Russia and China, economically and militarily and scientifically together, they can defeat the US and the West.
All right, last two questions. The most important of the whole stream, I think. Have you read the book, The Fourth Turning? And did you like it? I've never heard of this book. This person asks me every show. Have you read The Fourth Turning?
Someone else, I have not read it. I have heard of it, and the exact topic escapes my mind. But someone else talked about it recently. I wonder if he didn't also mention it to someone else.
And the last question that I think
But
is
I will,
yeah,
because
we'll all read it.
diligence, I will look up on it, and the next time I'm on, I will answer your question.
We'll cover the fourth
about the fourth
turning the
turning.
next time. Yeah, they've also asked Scott's
Slava Boga.
Yeah, Slava Boga. Okay, so this is the most serious question. So sorry if you're any trigger warning here. What is the best beer in Russia?
I don't drink beer.
Oh, well, there you go.
Sorry, I don't drink beer.
Why would you put a trigger warning on it?
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry, guys. I've never liked beer. I had an alcoholic grandmother who used to come home and give her little piggies kisses, right? And I've been absolutely revolted by the smell of beer since young child. I drink. I like my vodka. I like bourbon. I have actually 100-bottle bar in my kitchen. I don't actually ever drink any of it because it's all there for social occasions. I'm mostly a social drinker. I only drink when I have people over, and I never have people over so anymore. So it's mostly just been sitting there. But I like a little amateur mixology and the like. And I'll drink an occasional hard cider or something like that. But sorry, I don't like beer. I mean, if you like beer, great, good for you. I don't like beer. Actually, my favorite Russian alcohol is probably, Russian specific, other than vodka, because
Right,
vodka,
obvious.
right? Medavuha.
Oh,
Medavuha is something. It's a fermented honey drink.
yeah, honey.
It's
Yeah.
not quite English or Scottish mead,
No, it's not
which
mead.
I do love.
Mhm.
And it can be done several different ways in Russia between hard and soft varieties of it. There's a lot of different kinds. But there's a big all Russia honey festival every year, late summer, that comes to multiple places in Moscow where you get people producing honey from all over Russia, all different kinds of flowers and fields from all these crazy republics that you've never even heard of before and everything. It's wonderful. And they always, if you ask them underneath the table, they've always got some medavuha, some honey drink, some alcoholic honey made from, the honey in their region too. And you can always get a sample of it, right? And you take your little plastic cups and you go from place to place and you decide what is the best. And then you take 10 bottles of it home and you're set for the next year. So,
well, thank you, Mark. And this has been a dope start to our weekend. Mark, what are you working on right now? And we always know where to find you, but what are you working on right now?
Yeah, Sputnik. I'm doing rapid reaction for Sputnik. I'm doing anywhere between 3 to 5 radio interviews a day on Sputnik. Yeah, and as well, I'm often on RT and CGTN and the like. So that actually that and simply keeping on top of the events that allows me to stand on my soapbox about on all of those shows is what occupies most of my life, along with taking care of my crows and my Shar-Peis.
Well, thank you again, Mark. And thank you all for joining us on Friday morning. Today is Friday. I know I announced Friday last night on the live stream, but
Friday evening.
Every day is Friday if we want it to be. But thank you guys so much.
10 o'clock for us.
Hopefully next week we will get you guys with a Georgia episode, and we are taking the weekend off. Thanks again, Mark, and we will see you all soon. Go to ddgeopolitics.com, please. Give us money. Don't give us money.
You can't give me money, so give her money.
Bye, guys. Have a good